I'm Cliff Ribner, and I'm going to talk to you about collectivism and how sickening it is, how it's just poison, and it has many faces. The nature of collectivism is it treats people as being part of groups and not as individuals. It's inherently unjust. It's what communism and socialism are all, that they are forms of collectivism. They are the political form of collectivism. But there's also more subtle forms of collectivism politically. That's what we have in America now. It's been imposed on us bit by bit since 1906, really. It actually began in 1887. And what it is, it's these administrative agencies. They are a collectivist imposition on this country that was formed to be anti-collectivist. The whole purpose of the American Revolution was to assert the value of the individual. And so the individual is not a slave to the state. The state is here to serve the individual. This is a radical notion that was completely different from what had ever occurred in Europe before. But it was taking the ongoing British Revolution, which had really begun with Magna Carta. What it was is the British Revolution consisted of citizens of various levels extracting power from the central power, which was the king. The king had, when William the Conqueror conquered England in 1066, he was William the Bastard, by the way. He was a bastard son of his father. What the Normans were, by the way, and he was a Norman. He was in Normandy, France. They were actually Vikings. The Vikings had conquered that part of France, and it was practically a kingdom in Normandy. But William claimed the right to be king of England. How he got there, forget about it. But it wasn't through any blood lineage of English kings, by the way. Because England prior to then was not an absolute monarchy. It had a bunch of little kingdoms, but they were not absolute, and the people actually had rights. When William conquered, he imposed Norman law, which was basically the law of the continent, in which the king had absolute power, even over his nobles. The dukes and the earls, they were powerless in the face of the king. He was allowed to just take their land away. And that's what Magna Carta was about. One of William's descendants in the 13th century, King John, he was weakened for various reasons. And the nobles were able to extract various things from him. Because what it is, the nature of political power in society is that to the extent the central power has it, people don't. It's a zero-sum game. That's what it always is. The more power the government has, the less the people have. And the nature of collectivism is it's all about taking power away from individuals and granting it to groups over the individual. It treats the group as being more important than the individual. And it's what racism is, by the way. Racism is a collectivist notion because it consists of treating people of a single race as if that's who they are. They're just members of that race. They're not to be considered on the basis of what they do individually. And in current America, America is the least racist place on the planet. This slander that America is racist is absolutely hideous. We fought the Civil War, where 700,000 people died, basically to end the one anomaly that was still in American civilization, which was black slavery. And because the American Revolution was all about individual liberty. That was the whole function of it. And it was all about taking power away from the state. And that's why it was an anti-collectivist revolution. The individual liberty, the idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But those were just some of the things they were fighting for. And they spelled it out in the Declaration of Independence. As I said, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that was a slight change from the language that they derived it from by John Locke in the Second Treatise of Government. Locke talked about life, liberty, and property. The rights to life, liberty, and property are natural rights. The government is not allowed to take them away, and to the extent it does, it's a tyranny. And that's what England had prior to Magna Carta. And bit by bit, and in the 17th century, there were very radical revolutions in England, where they not only took power from the king, actually, they killed the king. Charles I got his head cut off in 1642. and basically there was a revolution going on for 20 years. It's called the English Civil War. And when they permitted a king to be back on the throne, because they had no concept of a country without a king. It was alien to Europe that there could ever be a country without a king at that time. The idea of an elected president was simply beyond comprehension. And it still is, really. What they have in all these other countries, like in Europe, it's not real. It's nothing like what the individual liberty that we have. And their laws are completely different from ours. Their laws are the Napoleonic Code. The Napoleonic Code was simply Napoleon's rewrite of the tyrannical laws of Louis XIV, which imposed power from the central government. You couldn't do anything anywhere without getting the approval of a bureaucrat, and these were bureaucrats who were supposedly representing the king. They were called intendants in France. But that's what Louis XIV did. He took power away from the nobles who had previously, when he was a kid, the nobles practically killed him and his brother. There was actually a civil war going on in France at that time. And when he became king, he wanted to make sure that never happened again. He wanted absolute power, which the kings of France had not had before. And not in that sense, even though William in Normandy had it when he conquered England. And what Louis XIV did was he imprisoned all of the nobles. He basically forced them to move from their actual homes into suites or rooms in Versailles. That's what Versailles is. It's a gilded prison that was built by Louis XIV to house the nobility of France, to keep them from fighting him, and also to keep them under his thumb. And he did things to amuse them. He fed them. It was very expensive to run, but it was basically a gilded prison. And he put the nobles there, and the people who were not nobles, they were peasants. They were treated, they basically were slightly better than serfs, unless they came to the cities. When they went to the cities, then they basically had the rights of free men. But even in the cities, they couldn't do anything without getting approval. There were things like, there were trades. You couldn't engage in any of the trades without being a member of a guild, so that the guilds controlled all of that. And they didn't want it. When the founders founded America, they didn't want any of that. They didn't want guilds here. That's why this whole notion of government licensing of professionals and professionals keeping people out of the profession who they don't want in it, and this can be done politically. That's one of the problems with licensing, that once you give power to the government, the license is a permit to engage in the profession. You're not supposed to need a permit to engage in things which are your natural right. And the pursuit of happiness that the founders were fighting for, as spelled out in the Declaration, was the right to engage in your trade or business, both to increase the value of the wealth of the nation and your own wealth. That's what it was for. That's what they were fighting for. They wanted a nation where people could engage in their own business free of government control, other than the common law and the laws of the market. Anyway, collectivism is against all of that. In a collectivist country, the government has all the power ultimately. And that's why they set up these administrative agencies. They take power away from all the businesses of the country and make businesses go to those agencies to get permission. And all of these environmental laws, saving the environment is basically this. It's treated as if it's some moral crusade that has to be engaged in, that supersedes all laws. We're supposed to have property rights in this country where the owner of the land can do whatever he wants to it, as long as he doesn't create a nuisance. And this idea of saving the environment, it's basically a pretext to invade the property rights of property owners, because they do things like the Endangered Species Act, where unknown animals. Well, first of all, the whole concept of it is crazy, because Darwin showed that under the laws of evolution, species come and go. That's just the way it is. And the Endangered Species Act is basically an attempt to freeze nature as it is right now, and to say that all these species that are there now, they have to be protected from dying out. We can't let that happen. and we're going to impose a law on it and intrude on people's property rights for that purpose. That's what that endangered species stuff is. And we're going to punish people if they use their own land and somehow harm some snail dart that nobody's ever even heard of in real life. Treating animals as superior to humans. That's what environmental law really does. It takes away human rights from the landowner and gives it to nature. But it doesn't give it to nature. Nature doesn't litigate. What it does is it gives it to all sorts of people who claim to be acting in the name of nature, like environmental litigation groups who come in and sue a landlord and prevent him from doing things like mining on his property. To open a mine in America now, it takes about 20 years once you decide to do it, even though the minerals are there. We have all sorts of mineral wealth in this country that people can't access because it costs more to litigate it and to deal with all the permits that they have to get it. Then it's just impossible. That's why only big companies can engage in things like mining. Small miners can't exist. And that's what these agencies do. They push out small businesses of all different types. Small farmers, the agriculture department prevents farmers from selling all sorts of things. They can't sell raw milk. They can't perfect certain products and sell them. There's just constraints on it. And by the way, the law that the government uses to crush the farmers was created in 1935 as part of the New Deal, which was just a catastrophe. As Roosevelt's own Treasury Secretary admitted, the whole thing was worthless. It didn't stop the Depression. It continued the Depression. That's why we had a Great Depression, because the New Deal made it impossible for people to hire people because it crushed the economy. It was the most radical collectivist bit of legislation that had been passed up till then. And collectivism does that. It gives the power to the state. And the state power is always administered through hideous bureaucracies. And these bureaucracies, they're all unconstitutional. They're given discretion to give orders to people. Under our real laws, our constitutional laws, the only entities that are allowed to order people to do anything are courts. And courts are only allowed to do that after due process. That was the right that the nobles got extracted from the King John in Magna Carta, that you can't take property without due process. And every time one of these agencies is created, and we don't even know how many there are. There's about 3 million federal employees that are engaged in these things. And they all have discretionary power, and they all think they're smarter than the people who they govern, and they govern them. People engaged in the businesses that have to report to them really have to report to them. You ought to see what the banking industry has to do. It's unbelievable. And it's why the banking industry, it's why there's so few small banks relative to the big banks. The banking industry is dominated by a few very large banks. And you know their names, Bank of America, and even that one. Several banks, it had been Wachovia, and then there had been Bank of America. They keep getting bigger and bigger because that's what they have to do in order to pay for the compliance cost of dealing with all the bureaucracies they have to answer to. Most of the people who work for a bank are not bankers at all. They're literally nothing but compliance functionaries who sit there filling out forms and doing all sorts of things that have nothing to do with banking. And the banks are forced to report all sorts of things. They have used the war on drugs as a pretext to make money, the use of money practically illegal. When you use cash money, when you put cash money into a bank, if you put $10,000 of cash into the bank, they have to report that just because it's cash. And if you put a few thousand here into one account and then a few thousand in another of cash, and it ends up adding up to more than 10,000, guess what? There's a crime. That's a crime. They actually go after people for this. It's called structuring. And it's a federal crime. They've made that a crime for you to put, if it's not quite 10,000, but if it adds up to 10,000, several different deposits, and if they can show that these are done in a similar time frame, even if you had no intention of defrauding anybody, that they have made that a crime. And that's the sort of thing that bureaucrats do. And of course, it was Congress that made it a crime. The Constitution doesn't permit that to be prosecuted. The Constitution is, they did not want the federal government engaged in criminal investigations or prosecutions. The Constitution spells out all the crimes the federal government's allowed to prosecute. Counterfeiting and piracy, but only piracy on the high seas. Those are, and by the way, all the other federal crimes that they claim are constitutional, they claim that they're all constitutional under the Interstate Commerce Clause. I won't go through the whole, I have shown that clause doesn't permit any of that. And the whole purpose of that clause was not to permit bureaucracies at all. It was to permit the federal government to have a policing power over the states, to prevent the states from harming out-of-state businesses in their state. That's the purpose of it. And by the way, it's a famous case called McCulloch v. Maryland, in which the taxing power of states was under consideration. And the court specifically said the power to tax is the power to destroy. And because of that, they didn't permit the state to tax a federal entity. But at that time, there were no federal bureaucracies. Nobody had ever even thought they would exist here. But if the power to tax is the power to destroy, the power to regulate is even more the power to destroy. And that's what these agencies are. These are collectivist entities. And what's terrible about, and that's just one aspect of collectivism. Collectivism is, as I said, racism is a form of collectivism. When you think of people in groups, it's inherently unjust. It's guaranteed to be unfair. The people that push racism, and of course now they call it affirmative action or DEI. That's what they were promoting this as a government policy. President Trump is now undoing all that to the extent that he can in a brief time. But that had become the operative principle of basically the whole federal government. And that is a collectivist notion, because what they meant by diversity was forcing companies and everybody else to have quotas, of racial quotas, looking at people, only hiring people if they're black, for example. White people need not apply. And that's the way it worked in real life. Quotas. It's sickening. And the quotas were not had nothing to do with anybody's merit. They had to do with things like race, and race alone. And that you hear these collectivists on TV talking about white people being evil. It's just sickening to hear it. If anybody was saying that about black people, they would be pulled off the air so fast. Anyway, these are different aspects of collectivism. But what we have is the presence of these administrative agencies creates a collectivist government, where the government has all of these agencies to supersede all other rights of companies by telling them what to do. And under our system of government, only courts are allowed to do that, and only after due process. That tells you right there how unconstitutional these agencies are. But these agencies have all three powers of government. They legislate, they act like courts, even though because they're ordering people to do things. Our government, the president is not allowed to order an ordinary citizen to do anything. But these bureaucracies do it. It's sickening. They have more power than the real three branches of government. And what they're a fourth branch of government, which is not in the Constitution, and it's not in there for a reason. The founders didn't want anything like that. And in fact, in Europe at that time, it was already being imposed in France, so that they knew exactly what they were doing. It had been imposed by Louis XIV on the French. Now, in his case, they didn't have there wasn't bureaucracies. There weren't whole agencies involved. It was individuals that Louis XIV sent out all over the country as his representatives to order people what to do about everything. People had to get their permission to do anything with their own property. That's really what it came down to. Because the idea was that the central government is smarter. And that's the whole nature of collectivism, that the idea that the bureaucrats and politicians at the top are smarter than everybody else. And they can appoint bureaucrats to do all these things, and the bureaucrats they appoint are supposedly smarter than everybody else about how they would use their own property. And they're not only smarter, they're more virtuous. That's the idea, that they're selfless. They talk about it being non-political. It's always political when the government is telling people what to do. What could be more political? And the people that are doing it have political ideas. And they are heavily biased. In fact, almost all of them are members of the Democrat Party. It's a one-party situation. And they don't treat Republicans very well. Everybody knows this. When Democrats do bad things, up until now, they've been exempt. They could commit all sorts of crimes. People like Comey. Trump is now is permitting the Justice Department to go after these people. But this is a completely new thing. When the Democrats were in power, they were investigating anybody they want. And this whole idea of investigating citizens is absolutely outrageous. That's not what the federal government's supposed to be doing. It's only allowed to do those two crimes, piracy and counterfeiting. And you'll notice because they're using the Commerce Clause as a justification for all these other crimes, the reality is both of those crimes are commercial crimes. Because what it is, the founders were interested in people being able to engage in business in a fair and just and free environment. And counterfeiting destroys the currency. And piracy, it's taking people's property away. So it's a violation of commerce. And trade was very important, of having ships go all over the world and trade, and the pirates stole it all. So it was interfering with trades. These are crimes that are specifically commercial crimes. So the whole notion, there's a case called Wickard v. Filbert, in which they justified using the Commerce Clause basically for the federal government to do anything. Basically, they said, well, if Congress, in its discretion, thinks that something needs to be done, that's going to be under the Interstate Commerce Clause, and we'll let them do it. So it completely violates the whole notion of the government allocating, or the government having enumerated powers, which is what the Constitution does. It enumerates those powers in Article 1, Section 8, and it's only those powers. They're very carefully spelled out. That's where those two crimes are, where the federal government is authorized to prosecute those two commercial crimes. So the idea that the Commerce Clause permits them to make other crimes is nonsense. Also, in the Federalist 42, Madison makes very clear what that clause is for. It was to protect businesses from bullying by states when the business went into a different state than the business originally came from. Because that was a problem that had been occurring in America prior to the Constitution. That's the purpose of the clause. It's right in the Federalist 42. James Madison wrote it. He was the principal author of the Constitution, so he knew something about it. And they've used that clause basically to completely eradicate everything about the Constitution that limits the powers of the federal government. It's absolutely crazy. And it has nothing to do with reality. It has nothing whatsoever to do with reality. And these are all collectivist abominations. The administrative state and the crimes that it permits to be prosecuted and racism. Racism was the anomaly, the black slavery was an anomaly when this country was founded, because the whole foundation of the country had to do with individual liberty. Well, what could be more different from individual liberty than being a slave? And they reckoned that now they were racist enough that they looked down on Africans. And also the reality is, the one thing that was being sold in Africa didn't have a lot of products to sell, unlike places like India. But there was trade with Africa. The one thing they had in great volumes, and they had ivory, but the one thing they had in great volumes were they had laws which permitted slavery. What it was is one tribe would go to war with another tribe and enslave the whole other tribe, and then they'd put them up for sale. And that was the biggest product Africa was producing during basically forever, or for a long time. And that's what the slave trade originated. So when Europeans bought the slaves, they bought the right to treat those people in a certain way under the laws of Africa. Basically, they were applying the laws of Africa in a different context. And so it was a form of property. That's how they viewed the slaves they had. But it was property rights they acquired basically under African law. But it continued down through the generations. And this was a complete anomaly in America, where the country was built on individual liberty. Individual liberty. That's what it was all about. That's what they meant by life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And by the way, in the Constitution, in the Bill of Particulars, which follows the beginning, they make very clear that they were also asserting rights which had been guaranteed to English citizens in what's called the English Bill of Rights, which the King of England was forced to sign in the Second Revolution of the 17th century. William of Orange became king. They kicked out James II, and not because he was a Catholic. He'd been a Catholic all along. That wasn't the reason. It was because he was doing things like raising a private army, which he wasn't allowed to do. He was also asserting the right to tax individually, which he wasn't allowed to do. Only Parliament was allowed to have taxes. And most importantly, he was asserting the right to dispensation. Well, there were two things. He was asserting the right to make laws so that he could criminalize conduct that was previously non-conduct. And that's what those agencies do, by the way. Every one of them violates what the King of England was forced to give up. But the King of England was criminalizing conduct, and he was claiming he had the right to what's called dispensation, under which he could refuse to prosecute people if he chose. So he was making lots of things criminal, but picking and choosing who he would assert the crimes against. In our Constitution, the president has to swear to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. He's not allowed to have prosecutorial discretion. There aren't supposed to be so many crimes that he has to that his representatives, the prosecutors, and that's what they are. They're part of the executive branch, and under the Constitution, in Article 2, the president is the executive branch. Everyone who works in it works because he has given them some of his power. That's the way it's set up. It's only if he permits them to have the power to work there that they're even allowed to be there under the Constitution. Anyway, there is no possibility of exercising the right to dispensation under the Constitution, because that's what it means to faithfully execute the laws. He's not allowed to refuse to enforce laws. He has to enforce all the laws, and the whole idea is there aren't supposed to be so many laws to enforce. And that's another thing that the collectivists have done. They've buried us in law. And every time there's a law made, it restricts everybody's freedom. And they claim it's going to benefit our health or something. They're not allowed to do that. It's that simple. And they can't get rid of them because of the filibuster rule, where they have to get 60 votes. Once they enact one of these things, they can't get rid of them. That's why we still have all that garbage legislation that Henry Morgenthau, FDR's Treasury Secretary, admitted from the New Deal was all worthless. It didn't do a thing. All it did was extend the Depression. And we still have all of that garbage. And we still have all the worthless legislation that was passed under Lyndon Johnson, which cost us trillions of dollars and did nothing. The war on poverty, it did nothing to stop poverty. The only thing it did was it destroyed the black family. Prior to all that stuff, most blacks were born in homes where there were two parents, and there was no more black crime than white crime at that time. Now it's a whole different story. They've destroyed the black family. 70% of black children grow up in one-parent homes, and we've got a situation where even though black males comprise about 6% of the population of the country, and blacks between the age of, say, 16 and 40, maybe 3% of the population, they make 50% of the murders in the country. And that's because of the Great Society legislation. It's been a catastrophe. And we've got all that legislation because Congress won't get rid of it because they can't. They have to get the minority to go along with it. And it's 60 votes instead of what's supposed to be in a Republican form of government, which is what we're supposed to have. Supposed to be majority rule, where the majority can repeal any legislation from the past. And the past is not supposed to govern the present. I'm Cliff Ribner, and I hope you like this video. And if you do, please so indicate and tell people about it. And go to my website, cliffordribner.com, and read my book, Freedom's Last Stand. Thank you.